Today on Locked On Canadiens, we continue our pre-draft coverage with a very special guest, and we're going to talk a lot of Q and then some high-risk, high-reward players that might be available later in the draft. All that's coming up in just one moment.
You're Locked On Canadiens, your daily podcast on the Montreal Canadiens, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hi there, everyone, and welcome to episode 649 of Locked On Canadiens. We have a very special episode for you today that is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. My name is Laura Saba. I'm one of your hosts, also known as the Active Stick, and my co-host Scott Matla is really excited for today's episode because we get to talk about some things we don't generally talk about with a very special guest. And our special guest is a friend of mine. Actually, I realized that we've known each other for 10 years because I remember that I met you when the Memorial Cup was in Shawinigan.
Yes.
And that is Jérôme Bérubé, who's the director of scouting for hockeyprospect.com. And welcome to our show, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me on.
We are so excited to talk to you. We have so many questions for you, but first let's talk a little bit about what you do, because I remember that when I first met you, you had started doing scouting very, very early stages, and now you've been doing it for a decade. And to be honest, like, you're one of our go-to people because you guys are the ones that put out the black book every draft, and that's the one we consult. And I just want to tell our listeners, we've decided not to debate that first overall pick anymore. We're over it. We've decided, Kent Hughes and Jeff Gordon can make their decision, and we're going to be happy either way, and we're going to litigate that 5 years from now. But for now, we want to talk a little bit about the Q. So, Jérôme, maybe tell us a little bit about how you got into scouting and what are the kinds of things that you do right now. Like, you've had an extensive career, so let's talk about that a bit.
I was always pretty interested in hockey prospect. I watched a lot of junior hockey before I even got involved into it, and like scouting back then was kind of like almost like you want to be a pro wrestler. How do you get how do you like get involved in this? And so way back 2009 2010 I started like a YouTube channel where I post highlights of players. And way back there was zero access to video of prospects anywhere. And that got me noticed, and Mark Edwards from hockeyprospect.com saw that. He contacted me, and then while talking, we kind of realized like I knew a lot about scouting and upcoming prospect. The Q, I knew the Q inside out or pretty well back then. So, and then started scouting for him, and then there was a lot of good scout on the staff. So like at the beginning, I'm just learning. I'm just trying to like learn from the other guys on the staff. And then, as guys move on, I move up the chart at hockeyprospect.com. And then I became like the head scout at some point. And then since this year, I'm the director of scouting.
Scott, you looked ready to ask a question.
I was gonna say, like, we love growth, and like it's crazy how things have changed. Like from, hey, I was posting YouTube highlights in 2009, 2010, which was a wild era in its own on YouTube, to being one of the preeminent leads and one of the biggest scouting services available. And with that wealth of knowledge and the years that you've spent, I guess my first question is, we've talked about the Q a lot, and it's in Montreal's backyard. The draft is there. We know that every year we go through, are they going to pick a lot of players from the QMJHL? Are they going to pass on that for other players? And I was wondering, who has caught your eye out of that league this year? Because last year the Canadiens, did pretty well drafting out of there. Riley Kidney and Joshua Watt turned out fantastic so far. Who has kind of caught your eye, or who have you kind of honed in on that, has stood out this year in the queue for yourself?
Yeah, it's a bit of an average year this year. Like, unfortunately for the Canadiens, they were supposed to get the the 220 draft, that was a really good year for the Q. You have, obviously Lafreniere, but you have Maverick Bourque, Hendrix Lapierre, Dawson Mercer, Justin Barron. So there's a lot of good talents then. This year, a bit more average. I think our first ranked player is Nathan Gaucher. He's a kid I've seen play for 4 years. I saw him play his midget draft year, and then the last 3 seasons with the Quebec Rampart. He's a guy I expect him to go in the first round. Guys of his size, the way he skates and the way he shoots the puck, don't usually go too late in the draft. So I'm guessing he's gonna go like probably in the last tier of the first round. He plays for Patrick Roy. He's a center. I'm guessing I think he might move to the wing at the pro level. I think maybe his playmaking is a bit more on the average side. So as a center, I like my center to be able to make player around them better. In this case, he has more like a shooter mentality. So I prefer those guys on the wing. He's pretty safe as a prospect. You draft him and you sleep pretty well at night after round 1, or if you pick him in round 2, you get a pretty solid pro player down the road.
If you pick him in round 2, you got a steal, is essentially the case. So you were talking a little bit about how maybe his playmaking isn't as strong as you would normally want from a center. Are there any other flaws to his game that people should look out for? Because, if he's going to be available that late, there's the 26th pick and there's the 33rd pick. So the Canadiens might have a shot at him. They might not go for him. But, what are the kind of things that you would want to watch out for with him?
Well, the reason why he's not higher on the list and is we think he's a third line type player, so we don't see the skill level being able to become a top 6 forward. His shot is good, but he's not gonna be I don't think of him as a becoming a 25-30 goal type player at the NHL level, but he's a pretty safe player. And then if you relate first and you get an NHL player there, and you're pretty sure that he's going to be an NHL player, whether it's only a third line player, doesn't really matter. Like, you want an NHL player. Late first, I think that's why he's going to go there. Teams are just going to, hey, if I can get for sure NHL player at that spot, I'm taking him.
I think it's one of those things where, we talk a lot on this podcast about how you can have a good quality bottom 6 or a desperation replacement bottom 6. I think for me, that's something that a lot of teams need to look out for. And it's really interesting the way that you evaluate players, because every time we talk to different prospect experts, a lot of people will give more weight to the upside. A lot of people will give more weight to the chances of getting into the NHL. But we've got a couple of names we want to ask Jérôme about, and that's all coming up in just one moment. But first, BetOnline is your #1 source for all your betting needs and sports info. Find all the latest sports developments, league reviews, and news, including NHL, Major League Baseball. The NBA is heating up, the off-season's heating up. Everything will be on betonline.net. It is your continued source for all your sports wagering information, including live betting, esports, and scores. And betonline.net remains the best spot for all of your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. BetOnline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite sports and events, including MMA, boxing, and golf. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and the action. BetOnline is where the game starts. All right, Scott, you had a little list of players that you wanted to ask our guest about that you're excited to know a little bit more about. And this is all from the queue, but later we're going to talk about eligible prospects as a whole.
One of the biggest ones, and because I know he is a large teenager right now, Noah Warren's been a name I've seen a lot, in that there are parts of his game that people like, and then there are parts that are drawbacks. And I'm wondering, he's in that range. We're talking that 26 to 33 range. And I look at that and go, a big rangy defenseman. Jeff Gorton had a knack in New York for maybe going a little bit, bigger. We obviously knew the previous regime did, but the Canadiens mentioned now they want to go more modern. Is Noah Warren a guy who can fit into what the Canadiens want in their system, good puck-moving defenseman, or is he more of that old school, kind of defensive defenseman type that it might not be the best fit for it?
I mean, if you draft Noah Warren, you cannot really expect him to become like a real offensive defenseman. That's not his game. Defense will be his game. He's like you said, he's huge. He's 6'5", 220 pounds. He skates really well. He has really improved since he's one guy that I've seen since he was 14 years old. So I've seen the improvement with his game. And this year was really impressive to see the improvement that he had. Mostly what it was with his puck game. He was making better first pass, playing better under pressure. And as a scout, that's what I really look into prospects. I want to see them improve. I don't want to see them regress from year to year. And Noah Warren is definitely improved this year. He's learning to be even more physical, playing a bit more. He was never like a super physical guy, but he has incredible tools to become one. So he's learning to use his frame more. And there's always been a comparable between him and Maverick Lamoureux, who's another big defenseman from the Qs this year. And at the beginning of the year, I would say I had Lamoureux ahead of Warren, and then maybe Lamoureux didn't improve as much this year, and then Warren did the opposite. So there was a kind of I had to switch them in my list during the year. But yeah, I don't think in Warren's case, I don't think you're gonna expect a lot of offense out of him. But can he be like a solid third pairing defenseman that when he's on the ice, you don't worry about one thing, and his puck game is improving. So to me, everything that he did this year was positive. So very good draft year for him.
I just looked up Maverick Lamoureux. One, I thought he was a winger, and I realized I was confusing him with Maverick Bourque, which is my fault. And then, oh my God, he's 18 and he's 6'7". That's my God, that's impressive in size. And like you said, though, they kind of went in opposite directions a little bit this year. And does that give, people in scouting circles pause that it's like, hey, this guy, we had him projected much higher. And now this year, he's not playing poorly, but the steps haven't been there for that next step forward. And does that kind of give people in the scouting service a little bit of pause and going and how you rank them, even though you had one higher than the other when you started?
Yeah. I mean, it depends where it's all a projection game, right? So at the beginning of the year, I look at, let's say, Lamoureux, I'm like, my goodness, 6'7", skates well, he's really physical. I mean, NHL team will be all over him. And then, you watch him in this season, and he got hurt a few times. And then the part of his game that had to improve, he didn't. That was his puck game under pressure. And then I just mentioned Warren, that's where he improved. If you can't handle pressure as a defenseman, it's really hard to, draft them too high, because there's a risk there that if you can't, I always say, if you can't retrieve pucks in your own zone and do the right decision with the puck, it's going to be tough to play at the NHL level. So this is what I mean by Warren and Lamoureux kind of switching role this year for me. And so I think, I don't know, it's tough to really get a good read where Lamoureux is going to go in the draft. I think he might go really high or really low. It's a tough one to get a read on.
I think one of the things that's coming up a lot now And it's not just this year, but when we talk about defensemen, we no longer talk about how big they are or how bruising they are. We talk a lot about decision making, and I feel like the game's changed so much, and it's just so exciting to see that like hockey smarts has a place on the stage. And I think I'm going to ask you a general question in your experience before we move on to some other players that Scott wants to ask you about, because you've been doing this for quite some time. Do you find that when you have a player that whatever position they play, like there's always this idea that you can't teach hockey sense, but do you think that with experience and with game minutes, like it's possible for somebody to learn to make better decisions on the ice and become a smarter hockey player? Or if it's not there, it's not there?
It's really hard to really teach hockey sense. You can teach to play a more simple game for, let's say, for a defenseman. I think that's what Noah Ryan did this year. He just simplified his game. He's never going to blow anyone with his skill level or anything like that, but he's doing just enough that you can project him as an NHL defenseman. But to go back to your question, it's really hard to teach hockey sense to a player. I'm a believer that either you have it or not. A lot of example, like I know Marty Sand, we talked about this year, and with Josh Henderson and even Brandon Gallagher at some point. I don't know. I'm ready to be convinced of it, but I don't have a lot of proof that this can be done. And I've seen it with many players over the years that I question the hockey sense, and then you watch them 5-6 years later at the pro level, they still have the same issue. So.
That's kind of where I was leaning, but I think it's really interesting to talk about, because you talk a lot, or what you view as a lot of prospects, right? People before they get to the NHL. You just talked about seeing players, starting when they were 14, whereas like when I'm like, my experience is like AHL is basically the earliest, right? So it's interesting to see like, where that kind of hockey sense comes from and where it forms. Scott, we have time for one more player to ask in this segment.
All right. We're going to round out with a trio of defensemen here then. The last one would be Tristan Leno is one of those names that's right in that range there. And someone we talked about a little bit before the show here. There's so many options for the Canadiens. And Laura and I have talked about if they pick Slafkovsky, if they pick Shane Wright, if they pick a center at 26, if they do this, they have so many options, it feels like. And Tristan Leno is one of those names that comes in there. And I'd like to know a little bit more about them or as a player overall.
Yeah. Well, he's been in the province of Quebec. He's been hyped a lot since pretty much his 14 years old season. He played midget AAA at 14. He was really good. Played on the Team Quebec that played the Canada games. He was the youngest defenseman on the team by everyone was a 2003 born. He was a year later, and he was as good as anybody on the team, if not better. And he had a pretty good start to his junior career last year. And then this year, maybe the progression was not there. Some guys are early bloomer type prospect. They're really good at 14, 15, and then they get to 16, 17. They're still good, but they're not progressing as much as you want them to be. And other guys are just more late bloomer, and then you can see them, they're starting to catch up. So Leno is still good. Like he had close to 50 points this year. I think the major issue with him is the skating has not really progressed over the last 2-3 years, and he's lacking a bit some dynamic abilities on the ice. He's smart. He's one of the smartest players from the Q, but you wish he was a bit like more dynamic with his feet, and so that's hurting him a bit for me as far as like his ranking goes.
And I think one of the things that we're talking about is in the modern NHL, if you can't skate, it's going to be really hard. We're going to ask Jérôme about one more player and then a couple of high risk, high reward options, and all that's coming up in just one moment. All right, before we get into our final segment, we want to remind you all that we will have draft coverage. We will be reacting. We will have clips immediately reacting to the picks the Canadiens make. We will have a live reaction show later in the night. We will be covering all the things next week, so make sure you are tuned into Locked On Canadiens and also Locked On NHL. There's going to be a lot of fun stuff. But in the meantime, right now, we are a few days away from the draft, and we're talking Q players. Scott, you had one more player you wanted to ask Jérôme about?
Yes, I do. Before we get into asking about some of Jerome's favorite prospects in this draft that we haven't talked about yet, and it's one we had Matt Drake on to talk about him earlier in the year. It's a Jordan Dumai of the Halifax Mooseheads. He put up 109 points for them this year, and Matt loves him. And admittedly, I admit that I didn't get a chance to watch a lot of him, and he's ranked, anywhere from the end of round 2 all the way through like the 4th round here. And I'm curious, as someone who's probably seen more of this player, just, can he overcome being 5'9" and 165 pounds and like actually be a scorer at the next level?
He's the ultimate scout killer, honestly. His production is kind of like insane when you think about it. Like his second half of the season was, amazing. Like he at some point he was averaging like 3 points per game at some point like late in the year. And Halifax was a good team, but not like a top team in the league. So he's a good player. He's 5'9", maybe he's more 5'8". And the skating, again, we just mentioned the skating for Luneau. If you're a forward and you're 5'8", 5'9", and your skating is, pretty average, there's not many of those at the NHL level. It's tough. If you're 5 foot, you can play in the NHL at 5'8", 5'9", but you have to be a good skater. So how much is he going to improve his skating going forward? It's almost like the impossible question to answer. I mean, if he gets drafted by Tampa Bay, I'll start getting worried because Tampa Bay has done every time Tampa Bay drafts a player that I question their skating, I get worried because they have done some great work over the years. Brendan Point, one great example. So yeah, like technically, like those 5'8", 5'9" players that have average skating, they don't usually really play at the NHL level. But he's still young. He still have like 2 more years of junior. How much is skating how much is it gonna improve over the next 2-3 years? I mean, it's like I said, it's impossible to really answer that. But at some point in the draft, you have to pick him just based on his skill level and his playmaking, is smart. So yeah, he's not gonna go high in the draft, obviously, but if you get in the mid rounds, I think he's going to be a pretty good value pick that could, be a pretty good pick for a team at this point.
And that's the thing that one of the things that you were talking about is Braden Point, right? A lot of times, like in hindsight, people are like, why didn't you pick him earlier? Or why didn't we pick him earlier? Things like that. There's a lot of players where they need a little bit of work, but either the organization has the right work or the player had the tools all along. They just didn't have the right, the right people, the right coaches, the right preparation to get there. I think, that's something that I always laugh because people always look at drafts in hindsight and be like, we should have seen this coming. And I'm like, even the people who do this every day, there are some players that either put in the work or they fall off. Like it's never an exact science, but yeah. I find it so interesting talking about players like that because they could be the steal of the draft or we could never hear from them again after 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, well, I just want to add, scouting is hard. it's not easy. People think it's easy, but it's not. So, in the Braden Point case, I mean, I don't really remember him too much from his draft year, so it's tough to really compare, let's say, his skating compared to Dumais skating. But, it's like I said, scouting is really hard, and evaluating skating is even harder. So a lot of things can change over, like, if you get a good skating coach, that can really help too. But some case, Britain Point might be the exception to the rule. So there's maybe 19 other guys like Point that never made it. So.
And that's exactly it. And that's something that like I find really interesting because like the reason that we talk to guys like you is because you know what you're talking about, right? Like if I could pull up a scouting report, but I don't. This is not my job. This is not my area of expertise. So we like hearing from you, but sometimes like we'll hear something and we'll be like, okay, like I don't know what that means, and like you can never tell until it's 5 years later, and that's something that I think it was Byron Bader that said, his model is 5 years long because in 5 years you're going to be able to tell whether it's going to be an NHL player or not, right after the draft. So we have a couple minutes left. So I wanted to ask you about whether it's in the queue or not. I think we kind of talked about your favorite players from the queue. Like, who are your favorite later round players in this draft where you think teams could potentially get a steal from them if things work out?
Yeah, I don't know if he's a later round type player, and then I'll stick with the Quebec team here. David Goyette. He's actually a kid from up north of Montreal, but moved to Hawkesbury in his teens, and now he's playing for the Sudbury Wolves. He's a player who was drafted in the first round of the OHL draft. Obviously, didn't play last year, and his first half of the season, he looked like he was going to be a 6th or 7th round pick the way he was playing. I think he scored like 2 goals in his first 25 games or something like that. And then came back after the Christmas break, and then he was one of the best OHL player in the league. So I think some people think he might go in the first round. I'm not sure if that's going to happen, but he really did everything he could in the second half of the year to put himself back in the conversation for at least a top 60 pick. His play at the U18 at the end of the year was a bit, not so good, but he was kind of like put on the line where, he had no chance of moving up the lineup. So he was put like on the 3rd or 4th line, and he was kind of stuck there. But he was really good in the second half of the season, and I think if you look for like a home run type pick, he might be one. He might be one in 1 year. You're like, wow, how did this guy didn't go in the first round? Or he might just never pan out. Since this is a Montreal Canadiens podcast, when you watch him, you cannot imagine that Jonathan Drouin is not a player you watch because their game is very, very similar. With their smart, with their stick handling, with their vision. So there's a lot of Jonathan Drouin when, like qualities when you watch him.
So I think here's what, one of those things is that like, so on this podcast, we always talk about like Jonathan Drouin's strengths, and there's always at least one person who's like, but Jonathan Drouin should be traded. So let's talk about, I think we have time for one more player you think might be a home run a little bit later.
One guy I think will go in the first round, but I've seen a list that he's not always ranked there, is Swiss defenseman Liam Biskel from who actually plays in the SHL this year with Lexington. He's probably my favorite player in the draft as far as like pure entertainment. He's huge. He moves really well in the ice. He's physical. He's nasty. Like he's like a 80s type hockey player. And then they, put him in the 2022 draft. But the thing with him, like I know we were short on time, but like his puck game, offensive game has really improved over the year. His play under pressure also has improved. So that's why we put him pretty high on our list. He's 17, I believe. But then, he's just not like he's not just a big, tough guy that can't play. He legit can play. But he also has like incredible physical tools. He's a bit like Eric Cernak type player. So if you get one of those guys in mid to late first round, you're pretty happy.
Scott, any parting questions for Jérôme?
No, I think that covered everything because Goyette was actually someone who I looked at a little bit in that range there because he's been all over, and I'm glad to know that, hey, other people have had their eye on him and it's not just me. I feel a lot smarter coming out of this than I did coming into it, which is always a good thing.
This is why, and I don't know if you're watching on YouTube or listening to the podcast, but if you're watching, you will note that I took a lot of notes. Like, this is one of those things where, like, I felt like I was at school, I was learning, but it was fun. Thank you so much, Jerome. Can you tell people where they can find your work?
hockeyprospect.com. You can buy our black book there if you want a PDF version. If you want the print version, you can get it on Amazon. And yeah, that's about it.
And you can follow Jerome on Twitter at Jerome_Bérubé. And thank you so much for your time. This has been really exciting. We don't cover the Q enough on this podcast, and I know that we have a lot of listeners that care about the Q. So I think focusing a little bit on the eligible prospects from the Q will give our listeners something a little bit different. And we have one of the smartest hockey scouting people on, and we've had some really, really good experiences. So thank you so much for your time, Jerome. As for the rest of you, if you want to follow us on Twitter, we're at LO_Canadiens. You can find my co-host at Scott Matlaw. You'll find me at The Active Stick. This week is a big week for the Montreal Canadiens, and for us, we'll be covering everything to do with who they pick, and all of that is coming up later this week. So make sure you are subscribed wherever you get your podcasts, as well as on YouTube. Thank you so much for listening. We will talk to you tomorrow.